The dog hadn't moved in 3 hours. That alone wasn't unusual. Echo was a Belgian Malinois who treated stillness like a discipline. In the 7 months since Avery Lennox had brought her home to the Kootenay highlands of British Columbia, the dog had perfected the art of becoming part of the furniture. Sitting with her hind quarters pressed against the wall beside the front door, her amber eyes fixed on the middle distance, her breathing so controlled it was almost imperceptible. What was unusual was the quality of that stillness tonight. This was not resting stillness. This was the stillness of a coiled spring. Avery had noticed it at 10:30 when she'd set down her cup of rooibos tea and looked up from the field medicine handbook she'd been half-heartedly reviewing. Echo had not moved from her post, but every muscle beneath that short, dense coat had gone rigid in a way that made the animal look carved from granite rather than made of flesh and bone. The storm hammering the Purcell Mountains outside had knocked out the hydro lines an hour earlier, and the farmhouse was running on generator power, casting everything in the amber warmth of low wattage lamps. The wood stove in the corner ticked and popped. Wind shrieked down the chimney. Avery set her book down and watched the dog. Echo. The dog didn't look at her. Her ears, normally swiveling like twin satellite dishes, had gone flat. That was when Avery's hand moved, without conscious thought, to the Mossberg 500, leaning against the side table. She had come to the Kootenays the way a lot of people come to remote places, running from something she couldn't name cleanly. At 28, she had been a paramedic with BC Emergency Health Services in Vancouver, a job she'd chosen because she was good under pressure, because she genuinely believed in the difference a single person could make in the first 4 minutes of a crisis. She had believed that for 6 years. Then came the call on the I-182 overpass in February. A family of 4, black ice, concrete barrier, and what she found when she opened the back door of the second car made her understand in a way she had no language for that some things could not be fixed in 4 minutes, or in any number of minutes at all. She had filed her resignation the following week. The farmhouse in Creston had belonged to her grandfather. 93 acres of mixed forest and cleared pasture, bordered on the western edge by a creek that ran down from the mountains and iced over entirely by November. The nearest town was 23 kilometers away. The nearest RCMP detachment was a 40-minute drive on a good road, longer in snow. When Avery moved in that spring, her mother had called it self-imposed exile. Avery had called it breathing room. She had not planned to get a dog. What changed her mind was a flyer tacked to the bulletin board outside the Creston Feed Supply, a notice from the RCMP Police Service Dog Unit in Kelowna, posting a retired working dog for adoption to qualified civilian handlers. The dog had been through the formal retirement process following a critical incident that had taken her handler. The notice described the animal as high drive, highly trained, not suitable for households with children or other pets. The subtext, clear enough to anyone who knew how to read it, was, "This dog has seen things. She is not easy. We are out of options." Avery drove to Kelowna the following Thursday. She was met at the facility by Corporal Diane Weatherspoon, the unit's kennel supervisor, a compact woman in her 50s whose manner was pleasant, but whose eyes were doing the kind of careful assessment Avery recognized from triage. Weatherspoon took her through the processing kennels, sleek German shepherds, a pair of Malinois running fence lines with mechanical efficiency, and then turned down a corridor at the far end of the building where a single kennel stood separated from the rest. Inside it, Echo sat. Not paced, not barked, sat. She was 80 pounds of coiled muscle and absolute restraint, her tawny coat marked with a dark mask that made her look like she was perpetually scowling. A long, healed scar ran the length of her right flank. One of her front toes was missing, the result of injuries sustained during the incident. She looked at Avery with amber eyes that held all the warmth of a winter sky over water. "Her name is Echo," Weatherspoon said quietly. She worked with Sergeant Declan Morrow for 4 years, ERT out of the Lower Mainland. That's the Emergency Response Team, our tactical unit. She was primary entry dog on a dozen high-risk operations. Then 14 months ago, Sergeant Morrow went in on a trafficking interdiction in the Fraser Valley and didn't come out. 2 other officers were critically injured. Echo dragged one of them nearly 40 meters through the breach point before anyone could get in to help. She protected him until backup arrived. Weatherspoon paused. She hasn't taken a command from anyone since. The trainer says her drives are fully intact. She can still work. She just won't. Avery crouched at the kennel door. Echo tracked the movement precisely but didn't shift her weight. What happens to her if no one takes her? Weatherspoon's silence was its own answer. Avery signed the paperwork before she drove back through the Rogers Pass that evening. The first 2 months were, in Corporal Weatherspoon's entirely accurate description, a lesson in humility. Echo tolerated the farmhouse the way a person tolerates a waiting room, with the air of someone who expected to be somewhere else soon and had simply not received the notification. She refused the dog bed Avery had set up in the main room. Instead, she positioned herself each night on the narrow strip of hardwood between the front door and the coat rack, her body oriented toward the entrance with the precision of a compass needle. She ate her meals with her back to the wall. She had never, in 7 months, wagged her tail. The local veterinarian, Dr. Lorne Whitby, who drove out to the property in his muddy Tacoma to do the initial health check, spent most of the examination with one eye on the dog and one on the nearest exit. "I've worked with police dogs before," he told Avery, packing up his stethoscope while Echo watched him from the doorway of the barn with the focused attention of someone reviewing a file. "But she's not off duty. Her threat assessment, she's still running it every second. Watch your hands if you move suddenly around her, and don't corner her." Avery had nodded, thanked him, and asked if she could use his name for the animal's ongoing care records. She was patient with Echo in a way she had not been with much else since Vancouver. She didn't force contact. She spoke to the dog in low, steady tones while she did her chores. She figured out, through trial and careful observation, that sudden metallic sounds made Echo flinch. Not obviously, but in the micro-tension of her jaw and the brief, involuntary compression of her ears. When that happened, Avery would sit down on the floor, wherever she was, pick up whatever book was nearby, and read out loud until the dog's breathing normalized. She stopped caring whether any of it was working. By the 5th month, Echo had begun to follow her at a fixed distance of about 5 meters. Not close enough to be called companionship, but consistently close enough that Avery was never entirely alone. By the 6th month, the dog had begun sleeping inside the main room again, though always at the door. She still hadn't wagged her tail. She still ignored the toys. But she watched over the property with an attention so absolute that Avery had stopped worrying about the bears that came through in the autumn, about the coyotes that tested the fence line some nights, about the complete and total absence of anyone who would hear her if something went wrong. She had started to feel cautiously like they were healing together. She had no idea that Echo was not simply guarding the farmhouse. Echo was waiting. The storm arrived on a Saturday in late November, with the particular brutality of weather systems that funnel through mountain corridors. By early afternoon, the snow was horizontal. By 7 in the evening, the hydro lines running along the valley road had failed entirely under the weight of ice, and Avery was alone in the amber lamplight of a self-sufficient farmhouse with a wood stove, a generator, 4 days of provisions, and a dog who had not moved from the front door in 3 hours. At 11:17 p.m., Echo stood up. The sound that came out of her was not a growl. It was a low, subsonic vibration, barely audible over the storm, that Avery felt more than heard, a frequency that raised the hair on her forearms before her brain caught up with why. She looked up from her book. Echo was standing with every muscle locked, her hackles raised in a ridge from the nape of her neck to the base of her tail. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at the window. "Echo," Avery kept her voice level. "What is it?" The dog didn't acknowledge her. She moved toward the glass in a tight, controlled line, her paws making no sound on the old hardwood, and pressed her nose almost to the frost-hazed surface. For a long moment, she was completely still. Then she started to pace, a short, precise back and forth that Avery had never seen from her, tight as a drill pattern, like an animal who had been given a specific task and was waiting for the signal to execute it. In 7 months, Echo had not reacted to anything outside that window. Not the bull moose that had walked within 8 meters of the house in October. Not the chainsaw of the neighboring property being operated a kilometer away. Not even the grizzly that had tested the fence in September and left claw marks on the gate post. Avery set down her book and went to the gun cabinet in the hallway. She keyed in the combination, took out the Mossberg, and loaded it with a deliberateness that felt appropriate to the moment. She racked the slide. Echo didn't flinch at the sound. Avery switched off the remaining lamps and moved to the window, keeping to the edge of the curtain. The generator-powered security light mounted over the barn flickered in the driving snow, and for a moment she couldn't see anything but white. Then the motion sensor over the gate triggered, and the outer light came on. A figure was walking up the driveway. Avery's breath stalled. The county road was nearly 4 kilometers away, and in this storm, utterly impassable for any ordinary vehicle. No headlights had appeared. Whoever this person was, they had walked through the storm, through kilometers of mountain wilderness in blizzard conditions and total darkness. The figure moved with a particular kind of deliberateness, not the stumbling, directional desperation of a lost hiker. Something measured, tactical, despite the weight of snow building on a dark jacket and the obvious drag of exhaustion in the torso. The figure moved with the posture of someone who had been trained to navigate hostile terrain, someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. Avery raised the shotgun. The nearest RCMP detachment was 40 minutes away in clear weather. Tonight, it might as well have been in another province. The figure reached the gate, unlatched it, didn't try the lock, simply used the emergency manual release on the exterior side, and walked up the stone path toward the porch steps. Under the security light near the front door, she could see a tall man, his face weathered and obscured by ice in a beard that had grown untended for what looked like weeks. Dark tactical-style clothing coated in snow. His left arm was held awkwardly against his side. Something about that arm, the stillness of it, the way his whole upper body compensated slightly around it, made Avery's paramedic brain register the word before she'd consciously formed it. Injured. Inside, Echo went completely still. The pacing stopped. She stood dead center in front of the door, and all that coiled energy redirected into absolute, motionless focus. Not aggression, something more complex than aggression, something that Avery had no language for yet. The man's boots hit the porch steps. 1, 2, 3. He stopped in front of the door. Avery moved to the center of the hallway, the Mossberg leveled at chest height. "Step away from the door," she called out, projecting her voice as clearly as the storm would allow. "I am armed. You are on private property. Step away and identify yourself." A pause, long enough that Avery almost believed he'd left. Then a voice came through the door, rough, low, barely carrying over the wind. "Is there a dog in there? Dark mask, scar on the right flank." Inside the farmhouse, Echo reacted as though she had been struck by current. The sound that came out of her was not a bark, it was not a growl, it was a sound that Avery had never heard from any animal. A high, raw, desperate cry that seemed torn from somewhere beneath training, beneath conditioning, beneath the years of silence and guarded distance. Echo threw herself against the door, both front feet, her full 80 pounds, crashing against the wood, Then again, then scratching with a frantic intensity that gouged the paint from the surface. She was whining and crying at the same time, making sounds that didn't have a clean category, and for the first time in 7 months, her tail was moving. Not a wag, but something more urgent, a flag of recognition so absolute it bypassed every wall she had built. Avery stood with the shotgun half raised, staring at the animal she thought she knew. The man outside spoke again, and this time there was a different quality to the voice. Lower, steer deer. The single word he said was not English. ECI. Echo sat down. Instantly, so hard her hindquarters hit the floor with an audible thud. She sat trembling, every muscle vibrating, her eyes locked on the door handle, and from her throat came tiny sharp sounds. Not sorrow exactly, but something close. Something that sounded like the auditory version of a person pressing their hand against glass to reach someone on the other side. Avery stood there for a moment, the Mossberg still raised, and thought about all the things Corporal Weatherspoon had told her in Kelowna, the ERT sergeant, the Fraser Valley interdiction, the handler who hadn't come out. Her hands were not entirely steady when she reached for the deadbolt. She turned the lock and pulled the door open, and the cold hit her like a wall. The man on the porch was in worse shape than he'd looked from the window. Up close, the left arm was clearly being held against cracked or broken ribs, the jacket beneath it dark and wet, in a way that snow alone didn't account for. There was bruising along his jaw, only partially obscured by the ice-matted beard, and his eyes, pale grey, carrying a depth of exhaustion that went well beyond physical, were not looking at her at all. He was looking at the dog. "Repose," he said very softly, "I'm here." Echo did not attack, did not circle, did not demonstrate any of the territorial behavior that Weatherspoon had warned about, that Dr. Whitby had been visibly nervous around, that had kept every person who visited the farmhouse at arm's length for 7 months. Echo crawled forward on her belly. It was the most un-Echo thing Avery had ever witnessed, that precise, contained, dangerous animal reducing herself entirely, pressing her muzzle into the man's boots, and releasing a sound from her chest that was so long and so complete, and so full of something that could only be called grief finally given permission to end, that Avery found herself gripping the doorframe. The man went down onto his knees on the frozen porch. His good arm went around the dog. He buried his face in her neck, and his shoulders shook once. A single involuntary movement he didn't try to suppress before he steadied himself. Avery lowered the shotgun. Her paramedic training surfaced before her shock could. "You're bleeding," she said. "Get inside." He looked up at her. The grey eyes were entirely alert, entirely present in a way that made it clear whatever his body had been through, his mind was fully intact and fully assessing. "My name is Declan Morrow," he said. "RCMP Emergency Response Team. That's my dog." He paused, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite apology and not quite warning. "And there are people following me who will be here within the hour." Avery Lennox had spent 6 years responding to the worst things people did to each other and to themselves, and she had never moved faster than she did in the next 4 minutes. She got Declan Morrow through the door. She got it shut and the deadbolt thrown. She got him to the kitchen under the lamplight and put him in a chair, and then she pulled the emergency trauma kit from the shelf above the refrigerator, the one she'd kept restocked out of professional habit, and cut away the left side of his jacket with trauma shears without asking his permission. The wound was a through and through, entry and exit both, high on the lateral rib cage, consistent with a round that had deflected rather than penetrated cleanly. She knew what a near-miss ballistic wound looked like. She'd treated 3 of them in 5 years on the road. This one had missed the lung by what her experienced eye estimated at less than 2 centimeters. "You are extraordinarily lucky," she said, pouring saline over the wound without particular ceremony. He didn't flinch. His hand had found Echo's head and the dog was leaning against his knee with an intensity that was almost structural, as though she was holding him up through pressure alone. He looked at the dog the way people looked at things they had not been sure they would ever see again. "They told me she was gone," he said, after the interdiction. Weatherspoon said they couldn't rehome her, that she'd bitten 2 trainers and they were going to. "She almost did," Avery said, pressing sterile gauze to the entry wound. "I adopted her 14 months ago." He looked up at her for the first time since she'd helped him to the chair. 14 months, he repeated very quietly. She was going to be euthanized. The file said her handler was killed in the Fraser Valley operation. Sergeant Morrow's jaw tightened. He looked back at the dog. They weren't wrong. They just had the wrong body. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. The interdiction was a setup. We went in targeting a trafficker moving stolen military hardware through the interior. Firearms mostly, and some ordnance the RCMP had flagged as missing from a CFB storage facility. What we hit instead was a private security contract, a company called Meridian Tactical Solutions that had been running a weapons diversion operation out of the same supply chain for 2 years. They had advance warning we were coming. One of their people was embedded in the joint task force. Avery worked steadily, packing the wound, not letting her hands show what her brain was doing with this information. The other officers in the breach, 2 of them survived because Echo pulled one out of the kill zone before anyone else could get in. He paused. "They left me for dead in a drainage ditch. I wasn't dead. I was unconscious with a head injury and severe hypothermia. By the time I could move, there was already a federal file closed on me." "Where have you been for 14 months? The answer came without hesitation, but with a flatness that told her more than the words. "Meridian picked me up before I could reach any of our people. They had contacts embedded in the response team. They needed to know what intelligence I'd transmitted before the breach. We had found a ledger connecting Meridian's principals to senior government procurement contacts. If that document reached the right people, the whole operation collapsed. They kept me in a facility outside of Trail for 11 months while they determined what to do with me. A month ago, I found a gap in the perimeter rotation. I got out. I've been working my way back toward one person I was certain wasn't on Meridian's payroll." Avery taped down the pressure bandage and sat back on her heels. "If you escaped a month ago, why are you only arriving now? And why here?" Morrow reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket with his good hand and produced a phone. A cheap prepaid model, screen cracked, clearly purchased at some anonymous stop along the way. One contact at the federal level, a deputy commissioner I'd worked under in major crimes, someone deep enough in the system that Meridian wouldn't have had time to compromise. "I've been trying to reach her for 3 weeks without exposing my location. I made contact 6 days ago. She's been quietly assembling the evidentiary file. She needed 72 hours to move on the Meridian principles without tipping anyone inside." He looked at the phone. "I stopped at a gas station outside Caslow to charge this. Someone pinged the location within 20 minutes. They put a vehicle on the highway and ran me off the road 8 kilometers from here. I went into the ditch, came out on foot, lost them in the tree line, and walked the rest of the way in the dark." "You walked 8 kilometers in this storm with a gunshot wound." "I knew where Echo was," he said simply. Avery stood and looked at him across the kitchen. The ice-crusted beard, the grey eyes, the hand resting in the dog's fur with the natural ease of something that had always belonged there. She had come to the Kootenays to be left alone by the world. The world had apparently arranged other plans. "How many are coming?" "2 that I know of, possibly a 3rd. They'll be careful. They think I'm injured and isolated, but they'll move before morning." On the floor beside the chair, Echo's head snapped up. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at the window over the kitchen sink, the one that faced the tree line to the east. Her lips had peeled back. No sound came out of her. In 7 months of living with this animal, Avery had learned to trust the dog's judgment above her own on matters of threat, and what she saw on Echo's face now was the specific, controlled alertness of an animal that had picked up something no human instrument in the room had registered yet. Sergeant Morrow was already out of the chair. The transition was so fast it was almost disorienting. One moment a wounded man hunched carefully over a kitchen table, the next a person for whom a wound was simply a parameter to work around. He picked up the Mossberg from where Avery had set it on the counter, checked the chamber in one smooth motion, and looked at her. Other entry points. Front door, east kitchen window, sliding door off the back mudroom. He nodded. Lights off, all of them. A pause. You know how to use a sidearm. Avery went to the drawer beneath the island and took out the Glock 17 she had purchased 3 weeks after moving to the property, on the recommendation of her grandfather's neighbor, who had lived alone in the valley for 4 decades. Sergeant Morrow looked at the Glock. Something shifted in his expression. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. She killed the kitchen lamp. The generator power went with it, and the farmhouse dropped into darkness that was total except for the faint orange edge of the woodstove door seam and the grey wash of stormlight through the windows. Echo bivouacked. The dog moved to the corner of the kitchen that gave her sightlines to both the east window and the mudroom door, and went so still that Avery could no longer locate her by shape. They heard the east window first, not breaking but pressure, the sound of a frame being tested from outside with something other than bare hands. Then silence. Then the mudroom door gave way in a single hard impact, the frame splintering clean out of the wall, cold air flooding the kitchen like a wave. What happened next was not something Avery could reconstruct in clean sequence afterward. She remembered the shape of a figure in the mudroom doorway, a suppressed weapon sweeping left to right across the dark kitchen. She remembered Sergeant Morrow saying the single word in a voice that had been stripped down to nothing but command. Echo riposte. And then 80 pounds of Belgian Malinois crossed the kitchen in the time it takes to blink. Silent, absolute, a creature finally returned to the full expression of what she had been trained to be, and hit the figure in the doorway at chest height with a force that drove him hard into the mudroom wall. The suppressed weapon discharged twice into the ceiling. Echo's jaws found the weapon arm, and the sound the man made was immediate and final, and then she held him. Sergeant Morrow moved toward the mudroom, and from the hallway came the crash of the front door giving way. The second figure came through fast, a laser sight sweeping the room, catching Avery against the wall beside the wood stove. The red dot moved toward something larger. Avery had been a paramedic for 6 years. She had worked cardiac arrests, highway extractions, overdoses, drownings. She had never once stopped to think before acting on a scene. She raised the Glock with both hands the way she had practiced at the range outside Creston on autumn afternoons, and she fired twice at the mass of the figure in the darkness. The first round caught body armor. The impact staggered the man backward. The second caught his shoulder, and he went down against the doorframe, his weapon skittering across the porch boards. She moved forward, trained the Glock on his center mass, and said, very clearly, "Don't." He didn't. From the mudroom, the sounds of struggle had ceased. Echo appeared in the kitchen doorway, and behind her, Sergeant Morrow half-walked and half-steered the second man, wrist-locked, arm pinned, toward the kitchen floor. The man was alive, and making enough noise about his forearm that Avery didn't need to ask how that encounter had gone. The farmhouse went quiet, except for the wind through the broken door, and the man on her porch, breathing in shallow, furious increments. Then, from somewhere over the eastern ridge, a sound that began as vibration in the floor before it resolved into the unmistakable chop of rotor blades. Not one helicopter. 2. They came over the ridge with their lights cutting through the blizzard, and the whole front of the property lit up white and brilliant under a pair of night sun searchlights. A loudspeaker broke over the noise of the storm. RCMP Emergency Response Team, do not move. All personnel on the property, weapons on the ground, hands visible. Sergeant Morrow leaned against the kitchen wall. He tipped his head back and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them again, and for the first time since he'd walked through her door, the carefully managed exhaustion in his face gave way to something that resembled relief. "She came through," he said quietly. Within 12 minutes, the farmhouse was full of people in tactical gear. The 2 injured men were helped to their feet and moved outside under guard. A paramedic, actual, certified, with a full kit, intercepted Morrow before he could argue and walked him toward the nearest flat surface. Avery watched from the doorway and allowed herself to be wrapped in a Mylar emergency blanket by an officer who looked barely older than the students she used to teach first aid to in the evenings. She looked for Echo. The dog was not at Sergeant Morrow's side for the first time since he'd come through the door. Echo was standing in the open doorway of the farmhouse, looking out at the snow still coming down in the searchlight beams, and for a moment Avery thought she was watching the dog orient herself, calculate, prepare to run toward something she understood better than this warm and chaotic room. Then Sergeant Morrow said something from across the room, not a command, just her name. Quietly, "Echo." And the dog turned around and came back in and lay down across his boots with her chin on her front paws, and her tail, very quietly, very deliberately, thumped the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. It was the first time in 7 months that Avery had seen that tail move, for reasons other than threat eliminated. A deputy commissioner arrived by helicopter from Kelowna just before 2 in the morning and spent an hour in the kitchen going over a recorded debrief with Sergeant Morrow, while Avery sat on the back step under the awning wrapped in the Mylar blanket, drinking the coffee someone had thought to bring in a thermos. The cold didn't particularly bother her. She had grown good at sitting with things that were uncomfortable. The deputy commissioner's people would have meridian tactical solutions in front of a federal judge within 72 hours, she was told. The source embedded in the task force had already been identified. The intelligence Sergeant Morrow had been protecting, the ledger, the contacts, the chain of procurement records, was, apparently, enough to bring down something considerably larger than anyone had understood when the original interdiction was planned. It would take months to process fully. The full architecture of it would take longer. When the helicopters were gone, and the last of the ERT officers had swept the property and filed their reports, the farmhouse was quiet again. The broken mudroom frame had been temporarily shored up with plywood from the barn by an officer who had noticed the gap and addressed it without being asked. The wood stove was still burning. The generator was still running. Sergeant Morrow sat at the kitchen table with an IV line in his arm and Echo's head on his knee, and he looked, for the first time, like a person who had stopped bracing for the next impact. "They'll want me in Vancouver," he said, when Avery came in and sat across the table from him. "Several weeks at least. Debriefing, investigation, everything the process requires." He looked down at Echo. "After that, I don't know exactly where things land. The department will formally retire her to me once the file is settled. But I don't have a posting, and I don't have a home. I've been moving for 14 months. I don't have much of anything right now." Avery looked at the dog. Echo was not watching the door. She was not scanning the room. She was asleep, actually, completely asleep, with the full weight of her jaw on Sergeant Morrow's knee and her breathing slower and more even than Avery had ever heard it. She looked at the plywood over the mudroom door, at the frame that would need to be rebuilt, at the long gouges Echo's claws had dug into the paint on the front door sometime, during those desperate few seconds when she'd been trying to claw through solid wood to reach someone she recognized through 93 acres of frozen mountain air and a full Alberta clipper of a blizzard. She had been meaning to repaint that door since August. The Kootenays are quiet, Avery said. Mostly. The snowfall is heavy between November and March, but the property is built for it. Generator, wood stove, 4-season insulation, and the creek doesn't fully melt until May. Lots of room. She looked at him across the table. Echo has been sleeping by the front door for 7 months. I always thought she was guarding it. I understand now that she was waiting. A pause. I don't think she should have to wait anymore. Sergeant Morrow was quiet for a moment. Then he looked down at the sleeping dog, and the expression that moved across his face was something Avery understood, without needing to name out loud. "When this is finished," he said, "we'll come back." Outside, the storm was finally quieting. The snow had thinned to a light drift, and somewhere over the Purcell Ridge, the faintest suggestion of grey was beginning to separate the mountains from the sky. Inside the farmhouse, Echo's tail thumped the floor twice more in her sleep, and the sound of it filled every quiet corner of the room.